And the Russians have been pretty explicit in recent weeks that they are not only threatening to hit targets inside of Ukraine, but they are also threatening to hit Western military targets. Russia is talking about taking major escalations here in response.
Welcome back to Drop the Mask. I'm very happy to have this next guest here because war is behind perhaps the biggest mask the government puts on, but I'm certainly not the expert on it. Kyle here is the news editor of the Libertarian Institute, opinion editor at antiwar.com, co-host of the Conflict of Interest podcast, and has a new show that is self-titled. Kyle Anzalone, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, very much appreciate it.
So tell us about yourself. How did you get to be writing for the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com? What's your journey here?
Yeah, no, you got the bio down, antiwar.com. I do the viewpoints every day. And the Libertarian Institute, I'm the news editor, so I write some news stories. And then I also do my show, Conflicts of Interest, and put out a news roundup. And I also do the debrief for the Libertarian Institute, so we send out a daily email, and I put down a little bit more of my opinionated thoughts there, so it's a little bit more fun to write usually in that way. Yeah, so I got started kind of on this path just being a libertarian back in 2009. I found Ron Paul. It was right after the 2008 campaign. And so then I was in college for the 2012 campaign, which was really awesome. Like, as far as it goes, I think from my time in the libertarian movement, like, that's the high watermark. I don't know how long you've been a libertarian or if people in your audience remember, like, back to this time. Ron Paul was legitimately, like, selling out arenas. I went to one of his events at University of Illinois. The basketball arena was packed. The line was around the block when we pulled up, and everybody was just so friendly. Even waiting in line at these events was like some of the best times I've had in the liberty movement, right? There's another event at University of Wisconsin-Madison. They sold out the arena, so they moved it outside. And Ron Paul is just speaking outside, and there's people up in the trees. They're on top of buildings. Like, it was just insane. So there was so much energy in the liberty movement then. And of course, Ron Paul's message wasn't do everything you can to get me elected. Educate yourself, benefit yourself so you can aid the cause of liberty in the future. And I really, I think I took that message very seriously. So, as time went on, Scott Horton ended up opening up the Libertarian Institute. And when he did, he said, if anybody wants to write or do anything, send me a message. And so I sent him a message. At the time, I had started a blog, and I was doing a news roundup where I just, took maybe 3, 4, 5 stories, and I wrote like a little, maybe 1 paragraph, 2-sentence summary of what was going on, a little bit of the libertarian bent from maybe a mainstream source. And I had signed up from Tom Woods' Bluehost thing. And so I was doing that for a few years. Then I was working at the Libertarian Institute. After I was at, doing some work for Scott at the Libertarian Institute for, I would say, like 2 or 3 years, just posting on the blog. Like, I wasn't getting paid anything. I started to make a little bit of money after that. And then Scott, when he was writing his first book, Fool's Errand, the Afghanistan book, he basically said, I can't do this and do my job at antiwar.com. So, he picked me to fill in for him at antiwar.com. And then he wrote another book and then another book and then published a couple other things. And so Scott's real busy at the director of the Libertarian Institute, and I filled in pretty well at antiwar.com, so I just stayed there as well. And just, as time has gone on, I kind of try to do the libertarian thing where, you're always looking for new revenues, not just ways to add money, but just, to deepen my resume. So, now I have my new show, the Kyle Anzalone Show. I have Conflicts of Interest. So, I'm always just looking for new ways to kind of get my name and my ideas out there too.
And tell me about the new show. Why branch out from Conflicts of Interest? What's different about the new one?
So I had gotten an offer from a production team that does really good work, that they were, willing to work with me on a new show. And through talking with them, it just seems like the best marketing strategy is to do a show named after yourself. So it's the Kyle Anzalone show. And right now, unfortunately, I can't do that show 5 days a week. And so I'm doing Conflicts of Interest 3 days a week, which is the same old thing. I run everything on Conflicts of Interest. Like, I scroll through the articles, I click through everything as I'm recording. Where with the new show, the Kyle Anzalone show, I have one or two people behind the scenes. They help me put all the clips together. They make all the graphics look real nice. They did the intro. All that stuff is taken care of. So I could just prep the content, come on and start talking, which I really like. And I'm getting used to it still. Like, it's weird not like having to click through stuff as you're recording, but I think it's going to be really great in just a couple weeks here when I really start getting into the flow of the new show.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, as a one-man operation myself, I could say that sounds really nice. But
Well, I'm glad you're here because there's a lot going on in the world, and the threat of war is always hanging around, which is probably one of the worst things going on. And there are plenty of wars to talk about, but the one I wanted to focus on mostly today is Ukraine, because of the recent escalations that the Biden administration is pushing. But before we get to that, I think everyone knows there is a war happening between Ukraine and Russia, but most people seem to know very little about why. And I know it's complicated, but can you give a brief introduction of what the conflict is about?
Okay, so I think the biggest reason for the war in Ukraine is just the Americans' unwillingness to accept their victory from the Cold War, right? The Soviet Union is gone coming into my lifetime, right? Like, I remember, like, I go to school and stuff, and when I go to different, like, my grandparents' house, they got a globe, and they have this big thing on it called the USSR, and here I grew up in a world that only had Russia in it. And so when I was a kid, I don't know if you remember the movie Terminator 2, but this movie had such a big impression on me and my geopolitics for a couple of reasons. One, I was terrified of nuclear weapons. That scene where she gets her like skin blown off, that's great. Like that. And I'm sure my dad showed it to me too young too, which is part of it. But then also, I'm about the age of John Connor in the movie, and I remember him going to Arnold Schwarzenegger in the movie. I thought the Russians were our friends now. And Arnold goes and he explains to John how Skynet doesn't care and that they would basically use the nukes and they would start the nuclear war before anybody realized that, hey, we're friends now. And I saw that movie, and then on 9/11, of course, you have who's the first world leader to call George Bush? It's Vladimir Putin. And so, in my little 10, 11-year-old brain, my worldview and my, formative worldview growing up was the United States and Russia were now friends against the new enemy, and that was the Muslim world. And so, as you kind of go through what happens kind of following 9/11, the United States just continues to provoke Russia. First, we say, oh, we're going to admit Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova into the NATO alliance. These are all red lines for Russia, and we continue to push it anyways. Over that, from 2008 until 2022, when you actually have the Russian invasion, basically you have a Western policy of just continuing to treat Ukraine as increasingly a member of the NATO alliance, which means their troops are traded by NATO troops. They increasingly have NATO weapons. They get NATO intelligence. We're conducting war games inside of Ukrainian territory. And so eventually, Ukraine is effectively a de facto member of the NATO alliance. And when that happens, Russia made some threats and they say to the West, this is our last chance to negotiate. This is, from really September to December of 2021, Russia is saying, last opportunity to negotiate. Do you guys want to do that now? And the West says no. They absolutely just reject negotiations with Russia, and they say, you're not going to do anything. And then Putin did in February of 2022. So, I think that's kind of the very big, broad overview of how we go from the end of the Cold War to end up being in a real war. I mean, it still could be called a proxy war, but a real war with Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, you mentioned that you thought Russia and the U.S. should be friends at this point. Is there any good reason why we couldn't have been friends? Why do we have to be enemies?
There's really not. A big part of it is just maintaining a need for the NATO alliance, right? You have this massive alliance, which I'm sure to a lot of the dignitaries, the generals, all the people in military command, the think tanks, right? There's so much money tied into this alliance that you can't just let it expire. You can't just say we no longer have a need for this alliance. And so they have to continue to manufacture different causes. And I mean, they tried to, have NATO be a pretty major partner in Afghanistan. Look how the Afghan war turned out. Libya, as much as it was Obama and Hillary's war, is also a NATO war. And again, that's something that goes on and happens and it is an absolute disaster. So, NATO is looking for new cause after new cause after new cause. And then in 2014, the US pulls a coup in Ukraine, overthrows the democratically elected government, installs Petro Poroshenko as the new leader of the alliance, and I think most importantly, starts to signal to Russia that they are going to be kicked out. So, just like the US has bases in, 100 countries around the world, 800 bases, right? And some of those bases are in Mexico. There's one Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. There's bases in Spain and Germany and the UK and right. And so imagine, let's say that Mexico had a president who, got along with the United States just fine. They let us have our military base there. And then one day the Russians come in and they overthrow that president and they install a new president who is suddenly very favorable to Russia. And not only that, but Moscow starts to go, it might be kind of nice to get the Americans out of their major military base there in Mexico and turn it into a Mexican military base. Well, obviously the Americans would do something. Well, they acted far before that, but they would certainly act at that point in time. And when we talk about Russia acting in Crimea, this was a fairly popular move. People always talk about there's a referendum that's held after the Russian annexation, and it is after Russia took over Crimea. And so, maybe the people there felt that they had to vote for Putin, but the polling was backed by international pollsters who went through and looked and interviewed people separately. And so 90% of the people of Crimea voted to join Russia. That territory was annexed. I think almost more importantly and more telling, 50% of the Ukrainian military that was stationed on the Crimean Peninsula defected to Russia when they annexed the peninsula. They didn't leave. They didn't fight. They became Russian military, right? That was their move. They wanted to be a part of Russia. And so if Crimea was going to go from being a somewhat Russian-friendly peninsula that was Ukrainian to being a pro-NATO military base, those people would rather be a part of Russia. And so when Russia again annexed the Crimean Peninsula, they just defected over to the Russian side. And I think that's really what puts the collision course right there, because then we start to sanction Russia, right? And once you start to sanction a country, we say, okay, Russia has to change all these policies. They have to end the reverse the annexation of Crimea. But also, Putin passed some laws that were not very friendly, from the Western perspective at least, towards gay people. And so now we're also demanding that Putin reverse those laws. Oh, and there was this guy in the UK, Sergei Skripal, who was poisoned by a Soviet-era chemical weapon, and we say that Russia did that, so they also have to, pay a penalty for that. And so whenever we put these sanctions on the country, right, it doesn't just become what we sanction them for that Russia ultimately has to reverse or undo. It's everything that they're demanding that Russia undo. And so this just makes it impossible to ever reverse or to repair the relationship. I think another big moment here is Syria. Between 2013 and 2015 in particular, Russia is really ramping up their support for the government Bashar al-Assad. And this is critical because it undermines the U.S. policy, which is to prop up and to ultimately support the Syrian resistance, which of course becomes ISIS and al-Qaeda. But they demand they have to prop up those two forces, or, when Russia props up Bashar al-Assad, that gets in the way of ISIS or al-Qaeda taking over Syria and deposing Assad. And so that combined with another major event. So right at the end of the Obama administration, it's 15, and John Kerry, our Secretary of State at the time, was actually in serious diplomatic negotiations with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And they have worked out a deal that would basically switch the policy in Syria from the U.S. to one of trying to overthrow Assad to one of trying to get rid of the remaining jihadists that are in the territory. And so that deal was actually put in place, and I think it was like a 4-week deal that needed to be phased in. And just as we're getting to the final phase of that deal, the U.S. bombs a Syrian position outside of a pretty frontline city, Deir al-Zor, and kills, I think, 80 Syrian soldiers. And they say, oh, we didn't mean to, we didn't know they were there. And this was a Syrian position that had been held for years and years and years. And it was also on a critical hilltop. And so once that position was attacked, it was actually taken over and by the rebels. And so this caused a lot of strife between the US and Russia and ultimately caused that deal to fall apart. And so yeah, just, I mean, there's been so much that has gone on between the U.S. and Russia, and so many off-ramps, so many potential places where this could have gone in a different direction. And the U.S. has just continued to, in the worst ways, provoke Russia, and in the most unnecessary ways as well. Also, I apologize if people could hear my dog. She's whining a little bit. Let me kick her.
It's okay. Mine's actually nipping at my ankles too. Anyways, yes, that's a lot, but let's fast forward now to the last couple weeks or so. So apparently the U.S. authorized Ukraine to use some weapons, some of its own weapons, into Russian territory. Can you talk about that decision, what it means, why this is important?
Yeah, so this is really the kind of the unthinkable things. And we also had to start with what happened at the beginning of November. Donald Trump won re-election. And look, Donald Trump will say things like, I'll end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. I don't believe him. I don't think you should believe him. However, when we do look at, Americans went to the polls to vote for two candidates who, relatively speaking, don't have all that dissimilar of policies. They do, vary on some issues. And one of the key issues that they did have disagreement on was the war in Ukraine. And the American people went to the ballot box and they voted for the candidate who was pledging to end the war rather than the candidate that was pledging to continue the war. In the US, we have, kind of an interesting system where it's not as though Donald Trump wins the election on November 5th and he's in office the next week. We actually have 2.5 months or so where this is going to continue to kind of drag on, right? Where where Biden is still, I guess, kind of the president. So the same White House is going to continue, right? I don't want to give Biden too much autonomy to say he is the president, is making all these decisions himself. I really don't know. But as far as it goes, that happens. And so now the White House is accelerating a plan that they've had and that they've been talking about over the past 2 years, which is to to Trump-proof the war in Ukraine, which means they want to make the war in Ukraine something that Donald Trump cannot end. And so they've already done like 4 or 5 things to do this. And some of these I think are going to have really big effects and some not so much. They made Mark Rutte the new...
Who's saying that we need to Trump-proof it?
American and NATO officials. It's just being openly discussed. If you go to the Libertarian Institute and search my name with Trump proof, you'll probably find 10 to 15 articles I've written out over the past year of different officials saying this. And it's usually not named officials. It'll be the Financial Times talks to U.S. and European officials who say their goal is to Trump-proof the aid going to Ukraine, right? So that's kind of how we learn about these things. So yeah, so as far as the Trump-proofing goes, they made Mark Rutte the new Secretary General of NATO, replacing Jens Stoltenberg after he was in that role for a decade because Rutte has a history of arguing with Donald Trump. They've moved the logistics of who actually transfers the aid to Ukraine and when has been moved from Washington to Brussels to the NATO command center. And this doesn't have a huge impact, right? It's not as if NATO gets to decide what American weapons are now going to Ukraine. It does have an impact though, and let's say we've committed a new tank to go to Ukraine. Well, then they could transfer that tank to Brussels to then decide when it goes to Ukraine. And so in this way, we could kind of rush weapons to a separate decision-making center so that Donald Trump can't pull the plug on it. So, NATO could continue to send American weapons to Ukraine after Biden's out of office. I think the more critical things that Biden is trying to do, and the one that I think is actually going to be the most effective, is the least talked about. And that is, NATO has been talking about coming up with a $50 billion loan for Ukraine. And what Ukraine is going to be able to do with that loan is buy weapons from Western countries. And so we all know Donald Trump is a big, kind of salesman type of guy. And from his first administration, one of the things that really appealed to him for say the Gulf Arab monarchies like Saudi Arabia was that they were pledging to buy American weapons. And so if Zelensky is sitting on a pile of $50 billion and tells Donald Trump, I'm going to buy $50 billion worth of American weapons, is Donald Trump going to be committed to ending the war on day one? I don't think so much. So I think that pile of money is huge, and $20 billion of that is coming from the United States, by the way. The other $30 billion is coming from other European countries. Now, they're presenting this as a loan, but it's not a loan. They're using the interest from frozen Russian assets to lend this money to Ukraine. And so the real situation is here, it is Western money that is ultimately going to pay for this. Ukraine doesn't have the money. Eventually, they're going to have to unfreeze the Russian funds, or the Russians are going to ask for their interest back. And so I see no way that the West doesn't ultimately end up paying for these loans, but that's the way it's going to be presented. The White House is also currently rushing $7 billion in weapons to Ukraine, and then they're going to try to pass another $24 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine that would be in place for the incoming Trump administration. Now, I think the $7 billion is actually a little bit more important here, because Trump's leverage over Kiev will be, I will cut off future assistance to you. Well, if Ukraine is already sitting on 3 months worth of weapons, maybe Zelensky decides to play the political game, and he thinks enough political pressure in the U.S. will mount and force Donald Trump to go ahead and sign off on sending some of those $24 billion of weapons and additional aid that was passed to Ukraine, assuming that gets passed, which I assume it will during the lame duck. And so, again, these are all ways to kind of Trump-proof the aid and move it forward. But what you initially asked me about before I went off on all that tangent was the U.S. did allow Ukraine to use our ATACMS. They're the Army Tactical Missile Systems, and they are missiles with a range of 100 or 190 miles to hit targets in Russia. And Ukraine carried out their first attack with the longer range variant. So it's important to understand there's two variants of the ATACMS that we've sent Ukraine. One has a cluster warhead in a range of about 100 miles, and these are far less provocative, where we have some with the conventional unitary warhead, and those have a range of 190 miles. We've only sent Ukraine a few dozen of those, but they've at least used some now in Russian territory.
Hey y'all, just wanted to say sorry for the poor audio quality on my end during this interview. Luckily, Kyle did most of the talking. But while I'm interrupting, let me ask a quick favor. After you go follow Kyle and get hooked into the Libertarian Institute, go over to my locals channel for some special bonus content. I've just released some bonus footage there from my interview with Jack Lloyd, and I've got another mini episode coming up there that's going to be a lot of fun. Find me at dropthemaskpod.locals.com or just click the link in the description. Let's get back to the show. So after the US authorized this, Ukraine was able to hit at least one target in Russia, and I don't know if this is a direct cause, but afterward, Russia said that they are now changing their nuclear doctrine. So what does that mean for us? Does it mean the nukes are on the way?
So, yeah, part of this is timed with that attack, and part of it was already going on. So this summer, Biden had been apparently convinced by the British government to go ahead and allow U.S. ATACMS and the British Storm Shadows, which are cruise missiles with a range of 155 miles, to be fired inside of Russian territory. And when that happened, the Kremlin came out and said, we are planning to alter our nuclear doctrine. And what they alter their nuclear doctrine to could sound a little wordy, so I'll go ahead and say what it is, and then I'll explain effectively how it works. Is what they say is that if Russia is attacked by any country, even if that country is only backed by and is not actually a nuclear power, but is backed by a third country that is a nuclear power, then Russia will take that as a strategic attack on Russia. And so what they're saying is, in this situation, Ukraine, backed by 3 nuclear powers, the US, UK, and France, if they are signing off on, and they have, using their long-range missiles for attacks inside of Russian territory, then that is, considered a strategic threat to Russia. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Putin is going to use nuclear weapons in response, but it does mean that he could go significantly up the Russian military escalation ladder. And the Russians have been pretty explicit in recent weeks that they are not only threatening to hit targets inside of Ukraine, but they are also threatening to hit Western military targets. I guess it would probably be American, British, or French military targets. I would guess they would be ones in Eastern Europe. They're not going to hit the American mainland. They're not going to hit the British mainland. But, Russia is talking about taking major escalations here in response.
How does the U.S. get away with not saying we're at direct war with Russia? We're funding Ukraine. We're giving them weapons. We're now telling them what they can do and who they can attack. How do they not say, yes, we are at war?
Right. And it's not just, I should clarify here, it's not just saying what they can do. When we're talking about these ATACMS and these long-range missiles, these require advanced intelligence to carry out. This isn't something that Ukraine is just picking these targets on their own. Even before, the U.S. was approving, I think, most of the targets that Ukraine was actually picking and firing American missiles at. But for something like these long-range ATACMS strikes, the Ukrainians are essentially only hitting the big red button here. The intelligence, the weapons, all the target, all that other stuff. I'm sure even a lot of the logistics, like how to get the missile launcher in a place where it could hit a target that deep inside of Russia without being hit by a Russian warplane. I'm sure all that is being carried out by the American side, trying to figure out which targets inside of Russian territory are worth hitting. Again, all that's being figured out by the American side. And so, these really are American strikes, just with the Ukrainian troops are the ones, again, standing on the battlefield, actually pushing the big red button to fire the missile. But that's all that the Ukrainians are effectively doing. And how do they do it without, I don't know, there's a constitution, right? I went to a public school. I learned all about what the war powers are supposed to be like. And this certainly seems like a violation, but it's just this kind of incrementalism that we see time and time again, where effectively the White House could get away with anything that they're allowed to get away with. And if they ratchet things up slowly enough and the people aren't paying attention, then they could get away with it. There was a story in the New York Times that came out about a week and a half ago saying, and this is a quote from the New York Times, this isn't Kyle Anzalone's interpretation of anything. They said that American and European officials were discussing trying to give Ukraine a deterrent that would effectively back Russia down, including giving Ukraine nuclear weapons, right? This is something that was apparently being discussed at relatively high levels, at such high levels it gets reported in the New York Times. Now, this isn't covered anywhere. It's not discussed in the mainstream media. This was buried in a New York Times article about really a separate issue. It's only because I happened to read the New York Times and to be completely outraged that I wrote this article, and we published it at antiwar.com. Fortunately, it gets picked up by Zero Hedge, and when Zero Hedge puts it out there, both senators, Senator Mike Lee and Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, also got their hands on it. And Senator Lee said this would be treason if we went forward with it. And obviously, I think that's the case, and it's good that Senator Lee thinks that's the case. But is there any chance that he gets a majority of the Senate, much less the kind of super majorities we would need in House and Senate to end up impeaching or removing Biden from office for this? Is there any desire among the American media? Are we ginning up any kind of discussion about this? No, not at all. And so they're allowed to get away with it because the president could do whatever they're allowed to get away with.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the nukes going to Ukraine potentially. I think you covered it.
I should add there too that the good news is I think Reuters yesterday had an article out that said that the White House told them they're not still considering this. I'm not sure we should just accept that, because the fact that they're even considering it or had considered it at all is absolute lunacy and is very alarming. And I'm sure the Russians were very alarmed as well. But at the same time, a little bit of good news there. It's not like they're actively considering, are we still going to send them nuclear weapons?
Also, right now, the U.S. is also suggesting heavily to Ukraine that they lower their conscription age. And for anyone that might not know, conscription is a fancy word for enslaving citizens to fight to the death for the honor of whatever leader is at the top. But at the moment, Ukrainian men from age 25 and up, I think, are being conscripted. And you have people like Lindsey Graham just salivating, telling them to lower it. And I guess my first question is, what the hell's wrong with Lindsey Graham? Do you have any insight into why he has such a lust for
this
seeing
is
foreigners
desperation.
killed?
This is desperation. The Ukraine. So here's the thing. I think Ukraine actually needs to do this if they want to keep fighting. Like if Zelensky really wants to keep fighting, and he could go on and how we need long range missiles, and we need to be able to hit this target in Russia, do this or that or the other thing. That's all not nice. But as the Americans, and this is one thing I think Jade Sullivan gets right, is that Ukraine really has a manpower problem that it needs to deal with, and that long-range missile strikes and other kinds of incrementally ratcheting up the advanced weapons that we give Ukraine really isn't going to solve Ukraine's fundamental problem, which is they don't have enough men on the front lines. In fact, I just wrote an article for the Libertarian Institute yesterday, December 1st. It's going over something written in the AP saying that Ukraine is facing a major a desertion problem. In fact, one Ukrainian lawmaker estimates that 200,000 Ukrainians have abandoned their posts. And apparently this is not just, and I think for the first year and a half of the war, this is a lot of people who, they rotate out. They get to go home on a brief leave, and they just never return. They either smuggle themselves out of the country, or they're hiding somewhere. They're not going back to the front lines. And it's interesting in the article that you have multiple soldiers who tell the Associated Press that we don't blame them. Everybody is exhausted. Everybody has been pushed past their limits. There are just some people that cannot do this. In fact, I read an article in The Economist about 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about how injured the people were that were headed to the front lines. And one man was blind in one eye, and he kind of jokes, well, it's not all that hard to shoot. It's just hard to hit something. Right, because he can only see with one eye. But these are the kind of men that are now being sent to the front lines in Ukraine. And so when they talk about lowering the conscription age, I mean, it's dark, it's horrific. I can't believe we're telling them to do it when we know the war is lost anyways. But if the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, that is what they have to keep doing. Throughout the war, the Western policy has kind of been, we're again going to incrementally increase the advancement of the weapons that we give Ukraine. So when this conflict starts, we're only giving them Javelin anti-tank missiles, right? And that was a holdover from the Trump administration. Then Biden ramps it up to include artillery shells and Stinger missiles, and pretty soon it's Patriots and Abrams tanks and F-16s and ATACMS, right? All these more advanced American systems. And Sullivan says in an interview with PBS NewsHour, and I don't think he gets it, but he says, we've done all this and it hasn't made a difference on the battlefield. What will make a difference is more manpower. Well, he's wrong about the manpower thing. It won't make a difference in the fact that Ukraine's not going to retake their territory. It will allow them to, keep this war going for a longer period of time. And I certainly do think they want to get this war not just to January 20th, but they want a decent interval, right? They don't want this thing, if it falls apart anytime in January, as much as you could blame Donald Trump, the American people will know if Donald Trump was able to destroy the Ukrainian side within 7 days, then, the Biden administration, they were in a bad situation to start with. And so I think what they're looking for is like that decent interval to keep the Ukrainians fighting till May, June, July. That way, when this thing ultimately breaks down for the Ukrainians and they have to, basically just concede to what the Russians want at the negotiating table, I think they want that to be firmly under the Trump administration so that they don't get blamed. But what's important to understand is you can't increase your support, the investment of your equipment to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians win the war, because the Russians maintain, and this is something that Jade Sullivan actually recognized under the Obama administration, that the Russians maintain escalation dominance in Ukraine, which means no matter what kind of military equipment that we give the Ukrainians, Russia could always ramp it up more. So we allow Ukraine to use our ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles to hit deep inside Russian territory. Russia is now launching their new hypersonic, nuclear capable intermediate range missile. And this thing, without even a warhead on it, destroyed a Ukrainian position that they had no ability to shoot it down, even with the American Patriot anti missile systems. They couldn't shoot down this new Oreshnik Russian missile, and it's a very advanced system. And so Russia will just continue. We can't help the Ukrainians win this war. We can only help them prolong this war. And a part of the reason they want to do this is, again, they're looking for their decent interval. The reason they've been doing it over the past 2.5 years, and the secondary benefit to them is that they want to weaken Russia, which really isn't even about Russia, by the way, because you may ask, why would they want to weaken Russia? It's because they see themselves fighting a future war with China, and Russia being a close ally now with Beijing. They want Moscow weakened, and so they could isolate Beijing better.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But first, what do the Ukrainian people want? Because it seems like we should be asking them, right? They're the ones allegedly fighting for the country. A lot of them are running away, but their population is cratered. It's between people fleeing and people dying in the war. What do they see at this point? What do they want?
Well, I guess a couple points on this. I think from the American perspective, in a way, it really shouldn't matter, right? Like, should we support this war or not really is just based on American interests. And I can make a lot of reasons why the American interest isn't there. But a part of what we've been used, or what's been used to sell this war to us by the mainstream media, was this is what the Ukrainians want. We have to help the Ukrainians defend Ukraine. And so from that perspective, we have seen for the first time, there was a Gallup poll that was released recently. I think it was done in October, that found that 52%, for the first time, a majority. I think a previous poll actually had the plurality of Ukrainians wanting a diplomat solution, but now a majority of Ukrainians do want a diplomat solution in Ukraine. Now, there's a couple other things that are important when we talk about this, though, and one of the reasons why I don't think we should just rely on polling of Ukrainians to decide if Americans should be involved here. And that is, from the very start of this, well, really since 2014, the U.S. coup in the back end, Petro Poroshenko, his incoming government, which, if you don't want to call it outright neo-Nazi, and there's a very good, huge chunk, I want to say like 20 pages or so in the Provoked book that you held up earlier, explaining how much influence the neo-Nazis had over the government in Ukraine from 2014, until now, but from 2014 till 2022. But, right away, there was a culture war launched against Russians in Ukraine once you had the 2014 coup take place. But more importantly, after the start of the war, Ukraine nationalizes the media, and they start rounding up anybody, people who go on Facebook and they say, I would rather have a deal with Putin than to have this war. You're going to be hauled off to one of Zelensky's gulags where you'll probably never return from again, just like Gonzalo Alira, an American journalist who was in Ukraine doing some reporting that the Ukrainian government didn't like, and he was jailed and, was killed at least through medical neglect, if not outright intentional murder. And so, like when you look at what the Ukrainians have been able to consume for media and news and the threats of going against the war, if 90%, I remember when I was at Freedom Fest in 2022, so that would have probably been July, so 4 or 5 months after the invasion, somebody came in and said, well, 90% of Ukrainians want American weapons to keep fighting, so don't we have to give them to them? And just the week before, I had seen a report from the AP about how Zelensky's thugs, dressed in black, full riot gear, are going and knocking on grandma's door because of some Facebook post she had. And so, of course, when you ask Ukrainians, 90% believe in self-preservation over making some meaningless statement that we would like the war to end. Because guess what? This was in, I think, April of 2022. So we have Russia's invasion in March of 22, Turkey starts to hold talks, and then Israel holds some talks and Turkey holds some more talks. And there's another deal, this Istanbul deal, that's on the table. And the Washington Post, and I swear to God, this was written in the Washington Post. And at the time, it was another thing like the nuclear weapons, where you read it and you can't believe that not every single person in America is talking about this. That it explicitly said that Ukraine was willing to make a deal for Russia to cede some territory, but have Russia withdraw from the pre-invasion lines. However, some in the West, and they didn't say who, we now know it was Washington and London, are unwilling to make a deal with Putin at this time. So Ukraine didn't even have an option to make a deal in 2022. Their Western backers told them no. They said, do not make a deal with Putin. We will not allow it. And then when the Ukrainians want to anyways, they started saying, but the Russians are going to attack you again in 10 years. And so if you make this deal, you'll have no defense then. And, basically just scaring Zelensky, making Zelensky believe he had no choice but to reject the deal, which he ultimately did, and leads to the fight. And so, what the opinions of Ukrainians, first of all, doesn't matter, right? Our leaders are going to do what they want, whether the Ukrainians want to fight or not. But to answer your question, now the Ukrainians have turned against the war, even with the massive propaganda complex.
Yeah. I mean, it should matter, but you're right. In the game, it doesn't matter. What is the end game here, or is there one? It seems like their goal is just to always have a war going on. And you talked about them wanting to weaken Russia so they can have a war with China. Why? Why do they want this?
Global hegemony, they believe that America and them must rule the entire planet. Right after the debate, which Biden's debacle ultimately leads him to, having to withdraw from the Democratic nomination, one of the things that he tells one of the reporters is, I run the world, for God's sakes, right? And so there's a lot of people in Washington who believe that they run the world. I guess there's probably a couple things, right? Do you want to be the class of people that lost America this status, right? Like our unipolar moment. Do you want to be the one that ultimately shifts back to a multipolar world? And so I think almost like in a cartoonish kind of way, it's like somebody trying to carry like 1,000 pounds up a flight of stairs and they keep falling and dropping and tripping. And had they, just done it 100 pounds at a time, they would have been done in half the time. But they're willing to drop any portion of the load for even any period of time. And so we're just, in a comical state right now where we're trying to balance all these competing interests that we can't possibly balance and maintain all of. I mean, even if you look at just 155 millimeter artillery shells, one of the most important weapons on the Ukrainian battlefield. Well, we've been sending them a cluster variant of it, which is far less effective, for a year and a half now, because we can't produce enough of the conventional shells. And oh, by the way, now there's a demand from Israel for more of those shells as well. And we've already depleted some of the South Korean stockpiles to send those to Ukraine. And so there's logistically not enough American weapons to keep this thing going, but they're going to try to anyways, because I think, one, they're unwilling to lose anything. Two, there's a lot of hubris. They really think that they could do everything that they're doing. If you look at what's kind of gone on since Trump won re-election, and then you look at what happened over the Thanksgiving weekend, I think there's a really good argument to be made that after Trump won the re-election, the intelligence community went to the White House, and Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, whoever's in charge there, listened to them say, we have some operations that we would really like to kick off now before Trump comes into the White House, because he will never approve them. And so this massive support, this massive wave that came from the Syrian opposition, Al-Qaeda in Syria, by the way, this is al-Jolani's boys. This is a jihadist, Osama bin Laden style terrorist who's been hanging out with a pretty large force in Idlib, Syria, under the protection of our NATO ally Turkey for the past decade. Well, suddenly he mounts a major offensive over the Thanksgiving weekend and takes the second largest Syrian city. Do you think the CIA might have had something to do with that? That they might have thought that Trump would have never gone for it and they had to do it now? And oh, by the way, there's massive protests going on in Georgia right now too. And again, it just seems like I would guess the U.S. intelligence community basically felt like this is our opportunity to do this, or we're not going to have one. And I also think this goes to kind of Trump proofing the war in Ukraine. So if Trump comes into office on day one and there's massive wars going on, that, you know, the Syrian government is falling, well, that's going to demand all the president's attention. So how is he going to negotiate an end to the war with Ukraine when he's trying to, you know, work out diplomatic solutions or something in Syria, which, oh, by the way, the US and Russia are on the opposite sides of as well. And there are reports, and I think this is now confirmed. I saw something in the Kiev Independent, which, you know, isn't a reliable news source, but if the Ukrainian government is saying something to the Kiev Independent and it doesn't seem to be for their interests, I would guess it's probably accurate. And what they said was that the Ukrainians were involved in providing some of the drones to the Syrian resistance. And of course, that again is all about diverting any of Russia's attention away from Ukraine to prolong that war even more.
Yeah, man. So I remember back in Trump's first term, there were generals just straight up bragging about how they ignored his orders. So how much do they actually need presidential sign off on things like this?
Yeah, so I think for something like this in the Biden administration, they probably do take it to the White House. And even in the Trump administration, I think there probably is just like the formality of actually going to the White House to get approval for, you know, major intelligence operations. And Tulsi Gabbard is going to be the director of national intelligence. And so I think technically she would be the one in the role to actually sign off on these operations, which, look, there's plenty of problems with Tulsi Gabbard, but if we're talking about people who could possibly be the director of national intelligence, she probably is the most dovish of any of those potential possibilities. And so I guess that's why the intelligence community would be concerned there. Now, as you mentioned, in his first administration, Trump was bullied around by his personnel effectively. He wanted to leave Somalia, and Mattis said, if there's ever a 9/11 style attack, I'll blame you for it. And so that happened when he wanted to withdraw from Syria for this first time. Both Mattis and his envoy to the Middle East, Brett McGurk, resigned from their post, and then James Jeffrey, his envoy to Syria, later bragged about how they lied to the president, how many troops were in Syria to you know, prevent that from happening. So look, I think there's probably a difference between conducting a major intelligence operation and just lying to the president. And one is a little bit easier to get away with than the other. So that's why they're probably more concerned about doing the intelligence operations now. And then once Trump comes into office, I saw a statement from, I want to say Andrew McCabe or maybe Merrick Garland, but either way, they were saying, listen, like all of you DOJ staffers who have apparently told the Washington Post that you're going to leave if Pam Bondi or Matt Gaetz ends up as Secretary of or the Attorney General, or, you know, if Pete Hegseth is in the Defense Department, there's all these bureaucrats who say that they're going to resign, right? And now the government is saying, don't do that, right? Like, you're going to have a lot of power in the Trump administration. And so I think those are kind of the ways they're going to undermine Trump, is those lower level personnel are going to lie to the president, obscure what Trump wants in order to keep the policy going. Remember, it was Alexander Vindman, the Ukrainian who was on Trump's National Security Council. He's the one who basically said that Trump had to be impeached because Trump was going against the interagency policy, right? That there was a policy from the U.S. intelligence defense community on how we deal with Russia and Ukraine. And Donald Trump, the sitting president, was not allowed to alter that policy according to them. So, you know, those are the kind of people that Trump's going to be dealing with. And unfortunately, I think he didn't do a good enough job of staffing his administration with Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel types who are capable of seeing Donald Trump's more dovish policies actually enacted, and, you know, putting some of the people, Mike Waltz, for example, in the position he put him in, I think is going to really undermine what Trump wants to do on foreign policy this time around.
Yeah, with Kash, from what I've seen, I think he's very good on this, but not good on the Israel conflict. He's on the wrong side of that, in my opinion. But
well,
do you think there's any hope?
I guess my point with more of these kind of people is that they're just clearly not a part of the establishment.
Yes.
And so, look, with Kash Patel, for me, it's all about Russiagate, right? Like, if he gets a cohesive narrative about Russiagate to the American, that was a coup attempt. At first against Donald Trump as the leading Republican candidate, then as president-elect, and then to undermine his policy as president. I mean, there should be no forgiveness for this, and every single person involved should be in an American jail somewhere. I mean, they tried to unseat the will of the American people with the Russiagate conspiracy theory. And so what, as much as we would like to say, like, Kash Patel is bad on Israel, and I do agree that his positions on it are bad. What happens if the American people understand what the U.S. intelligence and defense community did to us with the Russiagate conspiracy? Like, how many of our institutions are going to fall in the trust in these? And so, while, yeah, he made his personal opinions on the Israel conflict may not be good, my hope is that he undercuts the defense institutions so much that they lose credibility with the American people on all issues.
Okay, so it sounds like you're a little bit hopeful on that front. We've mentioned this a little bit here and there with Trump, but do you think there's hope that he does actually put an end to the Ukraine conflict?
I think the Trump proofing is going to be effective enough. I'm not sure we see Trump undertake any major escalations like we have under the Biden administration. And I think we end up with more turning into first a frozen conflict, and ultimately the Ukrainians a year down the line or so probably have to sue for peace out of attrition, and Russia gets what they want at the negotiating table. The only thing that I think Trump is going to be a major benefit on is when those negotiations start to happen, I think he's going to take a far more reasonable position. And so hopefully he takes Ukraine's NATO membership off the table, because I think that would be the major deal breaker. And so far, it seems like the Trump position is going to be, we're going to take NATO membership for Ukraine off the table for 20 years. But remember where I started my story back in 2008 when we offered the NATO membership to Ukraine. So 20 years isn't going to resolve Putin's concerns here. We've already seen him concerned about this for 20 years. And so as long as Trump is willing to do that, I do think we could see him eventually, bring a frozen conflict in Ukraine to a real official end a couple years down the line. But I don't think it's going to be like day one, or Trump comes in and really negotiates a deal. I think it's just going to be facts on the ground, eventually make it so that Trump allows the war to end where maybe Biden wouldn't.
Gotcha. One last question. I did have some notes about Israel, but maybe we'll save that for another time. I don't want to take your whole day.
Sure
last
thing.
question. Are we in World War III already?
Okay, so I've been asked this question a few times over the past 6 months, and my answer is mostly yes. So I think when you look at world wars, of course, it's kind of historians who determine the start date and the end date. And so being in the middle of it right now, I think we very well could be what historians will go back and say is World War III. My guess is that starts with the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine is what historians ultimately say is the start of World War III. That being said, if, let's say, Trump comes in and ends the war in Ukraine on day one, and tensions in the Middle East kind of fizzle out over the next couple of months, and Bashar al-Assad eventually retakes Syria, and we don't do a regime change in Iran, and we don't have ongoing war in Lebanon, and the situation in, Israel doesn't ethnically cleanse Gaza. Like, if all these things kind of resolve themselves over the next 3 to 6 months, which isn't impossible, it seems extremely unlikely to me, but it isn't impossible. In which case, I don't think then historians would say that we're currently in World War III. I think we would have been very close, but not quite there. I think kind of the difference between this world war and the previous world wars, of course, is the size of the battlefield, where, World War I, World War II, Europe, huge swaths of Europe is the battlefield. The Middle East and Africa are also battlefields. The Indo-Pacific is a battlefield, where right now you have all the European fighting really concentrated in Ukraine. However, you have most of the world dumping weapons into Ukraine. And they'll often bring up, oh, well, Russia's getting help from the North Koreans and the Iranians. Well, that is true at this point, but there's a list of 3 to 5 dozen countries that are also providing Ukraine with weapons. I think if you look at that and how the Middle East now, and it seems like with the additional attacks on the Syrian government, really, is starting to resemble more like Ukraine, where you have a Western side and you have a Russia, Iran kind of, this side of the conflict as well. And so where the Syrian government is backed up by Hezbollah, Iran, Shia militias, and most crucially Russia, and that's going to be on the side of a war against the United States and our Kurdish allies and the Al-Qaeda shop force that's backed by our NATO allies, Turkey. You could really start to see how the Middle East is also taking shape, much like Ukraine, where it's the West against Russia. Again, time will tell, but I do think that ultimately we will look back starting in February 22 and including right now, we are in World War III.
Hopefully it doesn't last too long this time. Kyle, thank you so much for joining me. Where can people go find your work?
Best place to find my work is the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. If you like what I had to say, please subscribe to my new channel, The Kyle Anzalone Show. We're just getting off the ground. It's like 2 episodes so far. We've done 2 weeks worth of shows. So if you can subscribe to that channel and help us start to crack into that YouTube algorithm, because they like to suppress these ideas, but if we could get a big base, then we could crack that and break through that.
Yeah, it's great. I just watched the first one yesterday. You can definitely tell the production quality is excellent. And get on the Libertarian Institute debrief newsletter, because that'll keep you up to date on everything Kyle's doing. Kyle, thanks again. Thanks everybody for watching. Drop the mask. We'll see you next time.